Imagine standing on the walls of Troy, watching 1,000 black ships darken the horizon as the greatest army ever assembled prepares for war. Tonight we'll walk alongside the warriors who fought in humanity's first recorded world war. From the bronze-armored heroes who became legends to the common soldiers whose names history forgot. Close your eyes and let the gentle fire sounds carry you to a time when warfare was personal, honor was everything, and a single wooden horse changed the course of civilization. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Tonight you're safe, warm, and about to witness the most famous war in human history. Not as Homer told it, with gods and supernatural intervention, but as it really happened, with bronze weapons, clever tactics, and human courage that defied an empire. Let your mind drift back through time, past medieval castles, past Roman legions, all the way back to the late Bronze Age, when the fate of civilizations could be decided by a single siege. Troy wasn't just another ancient city, it was the key to the ancient world's economy, controlling the only reliable passage between Europe and Asia. Standing at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connects the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, Troy commanded one of the most strategic positions on Earth. Every ship carrying grain from the fertile fields of the Black Sea region, every merchant vessel loaded with exotic goods from distant lands, had to pass under Troy's watchful gaze. The city's position was no accident. The Trojans' ancestors had recognized this geographical choke point and built their stronghold on a hill that rose dramatically from the coastal plain. From Troy's walls, sentries could see ships approaching from miles away, giving them time to prepare either for trade negotiations or defensive action. This commanding position made Troy incredibly wealthy, and inevitably made it a target for conquest. By the time of the famous siege, around 1200 BCE, Troy had grown into a magnificent city with massive stone walls, sophisticated defenses, and a population that may have reached 10,000 people, enormous by Bronze Age standards. The city was actually called Ilios by its inhabitants, while Troy was the name of the surrounding region. Archaeological evidence shows that this Troy was the sixth major city built on the site, each new version rising from the ruins of its predecessor. The walls that protected this final Troy were masterpieces of Bronze Age military engineering. Built from massive limestone blocks, fitted together with such precision that mortar wasn't needed, they rose more than 30 feet high and were nearly 15 feet thick at the base. These weren't simple barriers. They were sophisticated defensive systems with towers, gates, and angles designed to give defenders maximum advantage over attackers. The main gate, which archaeologists call the South Gate, was a marvel of defensive architecture. Attackers approaching it had to navigate a narrow passage that exposed them to arrow fire from multiple directions. The gate itself was positioned so that anyone trying to force it would have their unshielded right side exposed to defenders on the walls. This kind of military engineering showed that Troy's builders understood siege warfare as well as anyone in the ancient world. Inside the walls, Troy was a bustling international metropolis. The lower city, recently discovered by archaeologists, extended far beyond the citadel on the hill. Streets were laid out in an organized grid pattern, with residential areas, workshops, and warehouses. The city had sophisticated water management systems, including deep wells and cisterns that could supply the population during a siege. Troy's wealth came from more than just its position astride trade routes. The surrounding region was fertile and productive, supporting agriculture that could feed the city's large population. The Trojans were also skilled metalworkers, producing bronze weapons and tools that were traded throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Evidence from the archaeological record shows connections with cultures from Cyprus to Central Europe. But Troy's greatest asset was its diplomatic skill. The Trojans maintained a complex network of alliances that stretched across Anatolia and beyond. When war came, they wouldn't stand alone. They could call upon allies from dozens of cities and kingdoms throughout the region. This alliance system would prove crucial when the greatest military expedition in Bronze Age history arrived at their gates. The Troy that faced the Greek invasion wasn't a primitive fortress, but a sophisticated urban center with all the resources and knowledge needed to withstand even the most determined siege. Its rulers understood politics, strategy, and the art of survival in a world where warfare was constant and alliances shifted like the tides. To understand how the Trojan War was fought, we need to appreciate the military revolution that had transformed warfare in the centuries before the siege. The Late Bronze Age wasn't just about better weapons. It was about entirely new ways of organizing armies, conducting campaigns, and projecting power across vast distances. Bronze itself was the foundation of this revolution. Unlike stone or copper weapons, bronze could be cast into complex shapes that combined strength, sharpness, and durability. Bronze swords weren't just cutting weapons, they were precision instruments that could thrust, slice, and parry with deadly efficiency. Bronze spearheads could penetrate armor and shields that would have stopped earlier weapons. Bronze arrowheads could be mass-produced to equip large forces of archers. But the real revolution was in armor. Bronze plate armor provided protection that had never before been possible, allowing warriors to survive close combat that would have been fatal in earlier eras. The famous bronze panoply, helmet, breastplate, greaves, and shield created an armored warrior who could advance under enemy fire and engage in sustained close combat. The most elite warriors of the Bronze Age were the chariot fighters. These weren't the massed chariot charges of later periods, but individual warrior aristocrats who used horse-drawn vehicles as mobile fighting platforms. A chariot team consisted of a driver and a warrior, working together with practiced coordination. The chariot allowed the warrior to arrive at combat fresh and unencumbered, fight with maximum effectiveness, and withdraw quickly if overwhelmed. Chariot warfare required enormous resources and training. The vehicles themselves were precision-engineered machines, built with lightweight construction and specialized components. The horses had to be specially bred and trained for warfare. The warriors needed years of practice to fight effectively from a moving platform. Only the wealthiest societies could field significant numbers of chariots, making them the fighter jets of the Bronze Age. Infantry tactics had also evolved dramatically. The basic formation was the phalanx, a dense formation of spearmen with overlapping shields and long thrusting spears. This formation could present an almost impenetrable wall of bronze points to enemy attackers while providing mutual protection through shield overlap. Breaking a well-formed phalanx required either overwhelming numbers, superior armor, or clever tactical maneuvering. Siege warfare had become increasingly sophisticated. Bronze Age armies understood how to construct earthworks, siege towers, and battering rams. They knew how to conduct mining operations to undermine walls and how to build protective shelters for attackers. Counter-siege techniques had also developed, including dropping heavy stones, pouring boiling liquids, and using fire arrows against wooden siege equipment. Naval warfare was equally advanced. Bronze Age warships were purpose-built fighting vessels with bronze-reinforced rams for sinking enemy ships. Naval battles involved complex maneuvers as ships attempted to ram each other while avoiding being rammed themselves. The ability to project military power across water allowed kingdoms to fight wars far from their homelands. The scale of Bronze Age military operations could be enormous. Egyptian records describe armies of tens of thousands of soldiers. The logistics required to supply, transport, and coordinate such forces required sophisticated administrative systems. Armies needed supply trains, medical support, engineering units, and communication systems. Military campaigns became massive undertakings that could involve entire kingdoms for years at a time. This was the military world that produced the Trojan War. Not a simple clash between heroes, but a sophisticated conflict involving the most advanced military technologies and tactics of the Bronze Age. Understanding these capabilities helps explain how a siege could last for 10 years, and why Troy's fall required such an extraordinary combination of military pressure and strategic deception. The heroes whose names echo through history, Achilles, Hector, Ajax, Odysseus, weren't just literary creations. They were representatives of a real warrior culture that combined military skill, personal honor, and aristocratic display in ways that defined Bronze Age combat. Understanding how these warriors actually fought reveals the human reality behind the epic poetry. Bronze Age warriors weren't professional soldiers in the modern sense. They were aristocrats whose wealth, status, and identity were inseparable from their military prowess. Warfare wasn't just their occupation. It was their way of life, their source of honor, and their path to immortal fame. They trained from childhood not just to fight effectively, but to fight with style that would be remembered and celebrated. The typical elite warrior's panoply was a masterpiece of Bronze Age craftsmanship. The helmet, often made of bronze plates or boar's tusks sewn onto a leather cap, provided protection while displaying the warrior's wealth and status. Elaborate crests and decorations weren't just ornamental, they made the warrior more recognizable and intimidating on the battlefield. The bronze breastplate was both functional and symbolic. It protected the warrior's vital organs while displaying his physical prowess and economic status. The best breastplates were custom fitted and decorated with intricate designs that told stories of the warrior's achievements. Some incorporated actual muscle definition, creating an idealized bronze body that enhanced the warrior's natural physique. The shield was perhaps the most important piece of equipment. Bronze Age shields were large, often covering the warrior from neck to knees. They were constructed with wooden frames covered in bronze, leather, or multiple layers of oxhide. The shield's face was frequently decorated with elaborate designs that served both decorative and practical purposes. Distinctive patterns made warriors recognizable to allies while intimidating enemies. Weapons reflected both practical needs and personal style. Swords were not just tools but works of art, with decorated hilts and scabbards that displayed the owner's wealth. Spears were the primary offensive weapon, typically 8 to 10 feet long with bronze points designed for both thrusting and throwing. Elite warriors often carried multiple spears, allowing them to engage at different ranges. Combat between elite warriors followed ritualized patterns that balanced effectiveness with honor. Battles often began with individual challenges, where champions from opposing armies would fight single combat while their comrades watched. These duels weren't just personal contests. They were psychological warfare, designed to demonstrate the superiority of one side's warriors. The famous Aristeia, the moment when a great warrior dominated the battlefield, was a real phenomenon in Bronze Age warfare. When an elite warrior was fighting at peak effectiveness, properly equipped and supported, he could indeed cut through enemy formations like a force of nature. The combination of superior armor, weapons, training, and tactical support could make individual warriors incredibly effective. But even heroes couldn't fight alone. Elite warriors were supported by retinues of followers, companions, and servants who provided protection, assistance, and tactical coordination. A warrior like Achilles would have been accompanied by his myrmidons, not just companions, but a carefully organized fighting unit trained to support their leader's combat style. The warrior culture extended beyond combat to include elaborate codes of honor, hospitality, and loyalty. Warriors were expected to be generous to followers, respectful to worthy enemies, and protective of non-combatants. Breaking these codes could result in loss of status that was worse than death for aristocratic warriors. The pursuit of glory, kleos, was the driving force behind warrior behavior. Bronze Age warriors believed that fame achieved through heroic deeds could provide a form of immortality. Their names and stories would be remembered long after their deaths. This belief motivated warriors to take extraordinary risks and perform spectacular feats that would be worthy of epic poetry. Women played important roles in warrior culture, though often indirectly. Queens and princesses could inspire wars through their marriages or abductions. Goddesses and priestesses provided divine sanction for military campaigns. The promise of returning home to beloved wives and families motivated warriors to survive and triumph. The reality of Bronze Age warrior culture was both more and less than Homer's epics suggest. The individual heroics, the elaborate rituals, and the personal nature of combat were real. But so were the supporting systems, the careful planning, and the brutal practicalities that made heroic warfare possible. Understanding both aspects helps us appreciate why these ancient warriors became the models for military honor and courage that still influence our culture today. The Greek expedition to Troy wasn't just a military campaign, it was the largest and most complex military operation of the Bronze Age world. Assembling, transporting, and sustaining an army of this size required organizational capabilities that pushed Bronze Age civilization to its limits. Understanding the logistics helps explain both the war's duration and its ultimate success. According to Homer's catalogue of ships, the Greek army consisted of contingents from more than 150 cities and regions throughout the Greek world. Modern historians estimate the total force at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 warriors, an enormous number for any ancient army, but particularly impressive for a Bronze Age expedition that had to be transported by sea and sustained far from home. The logistics of assembling this force were staggering. Each contingent had to be organized, equipped, and transported to the gathering point at Aulis, where the combined fleet would wait for favorable winds. This required coordination across dozens of independent kingdoms, each with its own political interests and military traditions. The diplomatic effort needed to hold such an alliance together must have been as complex as the military planning. The naval component was equally impressive. Homer describes 1,186 ships, which archaeological evidence suggests may not be greatly exaggerated. Bronze Age warships were sophisticated vessels optimized for both transport and combat. They typically carried 50 to 100 warriors plus crew, meaning the Greek fleet represented one of the largest naval operations in ancient history. These ships weren't just transportation. They were floating bases that would serve as the Greeks' home for the duration of the campaign. Each ship carried not only warriors, but also supplies, equipment, weapons, and provisions for extended operations. The ships had to be designed and loaded with the understanding that they might need to support their crews for years rather than months. The variety of weapons and fighting styles represented in the Greek army reflected the diversity of Bronze Age military culture. Mycenaean Greeks favored heavy bronze armor and fought in coordinated phalanx formations. Island warriors might specialize in archery or light infantry tactics. Northern Greeks could provide cavalry or specialized siege equipment. This diversity was both a strength and a challenge for Greek commanders. Supplying an army of this size in enemy territory required careful planning and constant attention. The Greeks established their main camp on the beach near Troy, but they also needed to secure sources of food, water, and raw materials for equipment repair. This led to raids throughout the surrounding region and necessitated maintaining supply lines back to Greece. The camp itself was a major construction project. Archaeological evidence from the Trojan plain suggests the Greeks built a fortified base complete with walls, towers, and internal organization. This wasn't just a temporary encampment. but a semi-permanent city designed to house tens of thousands of people for an extended period. Managing such a diverse force required sophisticated command structures. The Greeks operated under a loose confederation led by Agamemnon as overall commander, but individual contingents retained significant autonomy. This created both flexibility and potential for conflict, as different leaders pursued their own objectives while nominally serving the common cause. The economic impact of the expedition was enormous. Maintaining such a large force required a constant flow of supplies from Greece, which meant that the cost of the war was felt throughout the Greek world. Some historians suggest that the economic strain of the Trojan War contributed to the collapse of Mycenaean civilization in the centuries that followed. Communication systems were crucial for coordinating such a large and diverse force. The Greeks used signal fires, messengers, and standardized procedures to maintain command and control. They also needed intelligence networks to gather information about Trojan capabilities, alliance structures, and potential vulnerabilities. The technological requirements were equally impressive. Bronze Age warfare consumed enormous quantities of metal for weapons, armor, and equipment repair. The Greeks needed smiths, metalworkers, and craftsmen capable of maintaining their equipment throughout the campaign. They also required engineers for siege works and naval specialists for ship maintenance. Perhaps most importantly, the Greek army represented a cultural and political alliance that transcended traditional boundaries. Warriors who had never fought together learned to coordinate their tactics. Leaders who might normally be rivals worked together toward common objectives. The Trojan War became a unifying experience that helped shape Greek identity for centuries to come. The scale and complexity of the Greek expedition to Troy demonstrates that Bronze Age civilizations were capable of military operations that rivaled anything achieved in later periods. The combination of naval power, logistical planning, and multinational coordination required to sustain such a campaign shows that ancient military commanders understood strategic thinking at the highest levels. The 10-year siege of Troy wasn't just a matter of surrounding the city and waiting for surrender. It involved sophisticated siege techniques, counter-siege measures, and technological innovations that represented the cutting edge of Bronze Age military engineering. Understanding these techniques reveals why Troy could hold out so long and how the Greeks finally achieved victory. Bronze Age siege warfare was fundamentally different from later periods because it lacked some key technologies, iron weapons, torsion artillery, and advanced mathematics, while relying heavily on others that were perfectly suited to the available materials and manufacturing techniques. Bronze Age engineers worked with wood, bronze, leather, and stone to create siege equipment that was often more elegant and effective than later innovations. The basic principles of siege warfare were already well established by the time of Troy. Attackers sought to breach defensive walls through mining, direct assault, or siege towers. Defenders countered with arrow fire, dropping stones, and various forms of active defense. The key to success lay in coordinating multiple approaches while maintaining pressure over extended periods. The Greeks employed several different siege techniques against Troy. The most direct was the assault, where warriors attempted to scale the walls using ladders or siege towers. Bronze Age siege towers were impressive structures, wooden frameworks covered with bronze plates or wet hides for fire protection, with multiple levels for archers and assault troops. Mining was another crucial technique. Greek engineers would dig tunnels under Troy's walls, supporting the excavation with wooden props. When the tunnel reached the proper position, the props would be burned away, causing a section of wall to collapse into the void. Counter-mining by Troy's defenders involved digging their own tunnels to intercept Greek mines or flooding them with water. Battering rams represented some of the most sophisticated engineering of the Bronze Age. These weren't simple logs suspended from ropes, but carefully constructed machines with bronze-headed rams, protective housing, and wheeled carriages. The best rams incorporated mathematical principles to maximize the force delivered to defensive walls while protecting their operators. The Greeks also used projectile weapons extensively. Bronze Age archers were highly skilled, capable of accurate shooting at ranges up to 200 yards. Slingers could achieve even greater ranges with stones or specially cast projectiles. Some siege operations included primitive catapults, lever-operated machines that could hurl stones over defensive walls. Fire was both a weapon and a constant danger in Bronze Age siege warfare. Attackers used fire arrows, burning pitch, and incendiary devices to set defensive works ablaze. Defenders countered with water, sand, and specially designed firefighting equipment. The use of fire required careful planning since it could easily spread beyond intended targets. Troy's defensive advantages went beyond its impressive walls. The city's elevation provided clear views of approaching enemies and made assault difficult. The narrow approaches could be blocked with obstacles and defended by relatively small forces. Multiple gates allowed defenders to sally forth and attack besieging forces from unexpected directions. The Trojans also employed active defense techniques that kept Greek forces off balance. Night raids could disrupt siege works and demoralize attackers. Targeted attacks on supply lines forced the Greeks to divert resources from the main siege. Diplomatic efforts sought to break up the Greek alliance or secure additional support from Trojan allies. Water supply was crucial for both sides. Troy's deep wells and cisterns allowed the city to withstand siege indefinitely as long as the walls held. The Greeks had to secure water sources for their massive army while preventing Trojan access to external supplies. Control of rivers and springs often determined the success or failure of siege operations. The psychological aspects of siege warfare were as important as the physical. Long sieges became contests of will as much as contests of strength. Maintaining morale among besieging forces required constant attention, while defenders had to resist the gradual erosion of hope that came with prolonged isolation. Seasonal factors affected siege operations significantly. Winter weather could make military operations impossible, forcing both sides to hunker down and wait for spring. Summer heat created different challenges, including disease and water shortage. Successful siege commanders learned to work with natural cycles rather than against them. The Greeks' ultimate success at Troy came not from overwhelming Troy's defenses through brute force, but from finding a way to circumvent them entirely. The famous wooden horse represented the triumph of strategy over strength, showing that Bronze Age warfare rewarded intelligence and deception as much as courage and persistence. The siege techniques developed during the Trojan War influenced military thinking for centuries. The combination of direct assault, mining, projectile weapons, and psychological warfare became the standard approach to siege operations throughout the ancient world. Troy's defense also provided lessons in how determined defenders could hold out against overwhelming odds through careful preparation and skillful tactics. The Trojan War wasn't just a conflict between Greeks and Trojans. It was a complex international war that drew in allies from across the known world. Understanding the diplomatic networks that brought distant kingdoms into the conflict reveals how Bronze Age civilizations conducted international relations and why local conflicts could escalate into world wars. Troy's alliance system was one of the most sophisticated diplomatic networks of the Bronze Age. The city's strategic position and wealth allowed it to maintain relationships with kingdoms throughout Anatolia, the Black Sea region, and beyond. These weren't just trade partnerships, but formal military alliances that obligated partners to provide mutual support in times of conflict. Archaeological evidence confirms the presence of warriors from dozens of different cultures in Troy during the siege period. Weapon types, pottery styles, and burial customs found in the destruction layers show that the city's defenders came from throughout the eastern Mediterranean world. This suggests that Troy's calls for assistance were answered by allies as far away as the Caucasus Mountains and the Egyptian frontier. The Trojans' most important allies were their Anatolian neighbours. The Hittite Empire, though not directly involved in the fighting, maintained diplomatic relations with Troy and may have provided indirect support. Smaller Anatolian kingdoms sent contingents of warriors who brought specialized fighting techniques and equipment types not available to local forces. From the Black Sea region came warriors known for their cavalry and archery skills. These nomadic peoples had different fighting styles than settled populations, emphasizing mobility and hit-and-run tactics. Their presence at Troy gave the defenders capabilities that complemented the city's heavy infantry and static defenses. The Lycians, from southwestern Anatolia, were among Troy's most valuable allies. Led by heroes like Sarpedon and Glaucus, they brought disciplined heavy infantry and siege warfare expertise. Lycian military engineering was among the most advanced in the Bronze Age world, and their presence significantly strengthened Troy's defensive capabilities. Ethiopian and Nubian warriors also fought for Troy, suggesting diplomatic connections that stretched into Africa. These troops brought different weapons technologies and fighting techniques, including powerful composite bows and unique armor styles. Their presence demonstrates the truly international scope of the conflict. The Amazon warriors, whether historical or legendary, represent another dimension of Troy's alliance system. Female warriors from nomadic cultures did exist in the Bronze Age world, and several ancient sources describe their participation in Troy's defense. Archaeological evidence from Central Asian cultures confirms the existence of warrior women who could have served as the historical basis for Amazon legends. On the Greek side, the alliance system was equally complex but differently organized. Rather than Troy's hub-and-spoke diplomatic network, the Greeks operated more as a confederation of equals under Agamemnon's leadership. This created different strengths and weaknesses in their coalition management. Greek contingents brought diverse capabilities that reflected the specialized development of different regions. Mycenaean Greeks provided heavy infantry and siege warfare expertise. Island peoples contributed naval forces and amphibious assault capabilities. Northern Greeks offered cavalry and light infantry specialized in mountain warfare. The Cretan contingent, led by Idomeneus, brought unique capabilities based on the island's maritime culture and advanced metallurgy. Cretan warriors were known for their elaborate armor and weapons, as well as their skill in both naval and land combat. Their presence gave the Greeks additional flexibility in combined operations. Some Greek allies came from surprisingly distant regions. Archaeological evidence suggests that warriors from southern Italy and Sicily may have participated in the expedition. This demonstrates that Greek diplomatic networks extended throughout the Mediterranean world, drawing on cultural connections that predated the formal political alliances. Managing these complex alliance systems required sophisticated diplomatic skills. Both sides had to balance the competing interests of allies with different objectives, fighting styles, and cultural backgrounds. Successful alliance management often determined the outcome of Bronze Age conflicts more than simple military strength. The economic dimensions of these alliances were equally important. Allies expected compensation for their military support, whether in the form of shared plunder, trading privileges, or territorial concessions. The costs of maintaining large alliance systems could strain even wealthy kingdoms like Troy or Mycenae. Communication between distant allies presented significant challenges in the Bronze Age world. Messages had to be carried by human messengers over land routes that could take weeks or months. This meant that diplomatic negotiations and military coordination required careful planning and often had to proceed based on outdated information. The cultural exchanges that resulted from these military alliances had lasting impacts on Bronze Age civilization. Warriors fighting alongside foreign allies learned new techniques, technologies, and customs that they carried back to their homelands. The Trojan War became a catalyst for cultural diffusion throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Religious considerations also played important roles in alliance formation. Many Bronze Age alliances were sanctified by religious ceremonies and oaths sworn before the gods. Breaking such alliances carried not just political consequences, but religious penalties that could affect entire kingdoms. The collapse of alliance systems often determined the outcome of Bronze Age conflicts. Troy's ultimate defeat came partly from the gradual attrition of Allied support as the siege dragged on. Maintaining long-distance alliances for extended periods proved beyond the capabilities of most Bronze Age diplomatic systems. For 10 years, two massive armies faced each other across the plain of Troy, turning the region into the world's first prolonged international conflict zone. Understanding daily life during this extended siege reveals how Bronze Age societies adapted to total war and how ordinary people survived in extraordinary circumstances. The Greek camp on the beach near Troy evolved from a temporary military installation into a semi-permanent city, housing tens of thousands of people. Archaeological evidence suggests this camp covered several square miles and included not just military facilities, but workshops, markets, residential areas, and even entertainment venues. This was urban planning on a massive scale, created under wartime conditions. Housing in the Greek camp reflected both military necessity and social hierarchy. Common soldiers lived in simple shelters constructed from ship timber, canvas, and local materials. Officers had more elaborate quarters that reflected their status and provided better protection from weather. The highest-ranking leaders maintained pavilions that served as both residences and command centers. Food supply was a constant challenge for both sides. The Greeks had to provision their enormous army through supply lines that stretched back to Greece, supplemented by raids on the surrounding countryside. The siege isolated Troy from its normal food sources, forcing the defenders to rely on stored supplies and whatever could be produced within the city walls. Both armies developed sophisticated systems for food preservation and distribution. The Greeks operated what amounted to military commissaries that managed supplies and ensured equitable distribution. Troy's defenders rationed food carefully and developed techniques for maximizing nutrition from limited supplies. Archaeological evidence shows both sides consumed a diet based on grain, preserved meat, and locally available fruits and vegetables. Water supply presented different challenges for each side. The Greeks established their camp near streams and springs, but they had to secure these water sources against Trojan interference. Troy's defenders relied on deep wells and cisterns within the city walls, but they had to carefully manage consumption to prevent shortages during the extended siege. Medical care became increasingly important as the siege dragged on. Both sides developed field hospitals and trained medical personnel to treat combat injuries and diseases. Bronze Age medicine was more sophisticated than often assumed, including surgical techniques, pharmaceutical treatments, and understanding of hygiene principles that could prevent epidemics. Disease was a constant threat in both camps. Large concentrations of people in confined spaces, combined with limited sanitation facilities, created ideal conditions for infectious diseases. Both sides had to develop public health measures, including waste management, quarantine procedures, and preventive medicine practices. Trade and commerce continued even during active warfare. Neutral merchants found ways to supply both sides with essential goods, luxury items, and specialized equipment. This underground economy created opportunities for information exchange and diplomatic communication that operated parallel to official military activities. Entertainment and cultural activities helped maintain morale during the long siege. The Greeks organized athletic competitions, musical performances, and storytelling sessions that preserved cultural traditions while building unit cohesion. Archaeological evidence suggests they also imported professional entertainers from Greece to boost spirits during difficult periods. Religious observances became more important rather than less during the extended conflict. Both sides intensified their religious practices, seeking divine favor and protection. This included regular sacrifices, festivals, and ceremonies that maintained connections to traditional beliefs while adapting to wartime circumstances. Communication with home remained crucial for maintaining motivation among the troops. Both sides established courier systems that carried messages between the siege area and distant homelands. These communications included official reports, personal letters, and intelligence information that kept both armies connected to their supporting populations. Crafts and manufacturing continued in both camps as soldiers and civilians adapted existing skills to wartime needs. The Greeks established workshops for weapon repair, equipment maintenance, and production of specialized siege equipment. Troy's defenders focused on maintaining defensive equipment and producing supplies needed for extended resistance. Women played important roles in wartime society, though their specific functions varied between the two sides. In the Greek camp, women served as medical personnel, food preparers, and providers of various support services. In besieged Troy, women participated more directly in defense activities while maintaining essential civilian functions. Children born during the siege grew up in a unique environment where war was the normal state of affairs. These siege children developed different perspectives on conflict, community, and survival than children raised in peacetime societies. Their experiences would influence Bronze Age culture for generations after the war ended. The economic impact of the extended conflict affected both local and distant regions. Resources devoted to the war effort couldn't be used for normal economic activities, while the concentration of people and wealth in the siege area created new patterns of trade and exchange that persisted long after the fighting ended. Seasonal rhythms continued to influence daily life even during wartime. Winter brought reduced military activity, but increased challenges in food supply and heating. Summer intensified fighting, but also created opportunities for raiding and supply operations. Both sides learned to adapt their strategies to natural cycles. The psychological effects of prolonged warfare shaped individual and community behavior in lasting ways. Veterans of the Trojan War carried their experiences back to communities throughout the Bronze Age world, influencing military thinking, social organization, and cultural values for centuries to come. The weapons and equipment used during the Trojan War represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age military technology. Understanding these innovations reveals how ancient craftsmen pushed the boundaries of their materials and techniques to create tools of war that were both functional and beautiful. Bronze weapon technology had reached extraordinary sophistication by the time of the Trojan War. Swordsmiths had learned to create blades that combined different bronze alloys in single weapons, producing edges that were harder than the core for superior cutting ability, while maintaining flexibility that prevented breaking. The best Bronze Age swords were technological marvels that wouldn't be surpassed until ironworking reached maturity centuries later. Spear technology was equally advanced. Bronze Age spearheads weren't just sharp points, but engineered weapons optimized for specific combat roles. Thrusting spears had broad, leaf-shaped heads designed to create massive wounds while remaining easy to withdraw. Throwing spears used narrower heads that could penetrate armor and shields. Some specialized spearheads included barbs or tangs that made them almost impossible to remove from wounds or shields. Armor technology reached heights that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. Complete bronze panoplies provided protection that covered warriors from head to foot while remaining flexible enough for effective combat. The famous Dendra panoply, discovered in Greece and dating to just before the Trojan War period, shows that Bronze Age armorers understood principles of articulation, weight distribution, and protection that rival modern body armor design. Shield technology was particularly sophisticated. Bronze Age shields weren't just protective barriers, but carefully engineered systems that combined multiple materials for optimal performance. The typical shield used a wooden frame covered with multiple layers of leather, with bronze reinforcement at stress points. Some shields incorporated metal strips or studs that could deflect weapons while maintaining lightweight. Helmet design showed remarkable innovation in balancing protection with functionality. Bronze helmets were often constructed from multiple pieces that provided complete head protection while allowing good vision and hearing. Some incorporated articulated cheek guards and neck protection that could be adjusted for different combat situations. Decorative elements weren't just ornamental, but served practical purposes, like deflecting weapons or intimidating enemies. Chariot technology represented some of the most advanced engineering of the Bronze Age. War chariots were precision-built machines that had to be light enough for speed while strong enough to withstand combat stresses. They incorporated spoke wheels, flexible suspension systems, and specialized components that required sophisticated understanding of mechanics and materials science. Siege equipment used during the Trojan War demonstrated advanced engineering principles. Battering rams incorporated leverage systems that multiplied human force while protecting operators. Siege towers used sophisticated carpentry techniques to create structures that were both tall enough to overlook defensive walls and stable enough to remain upright during combat. Projectile weapons showed remarkable sophistication in both design and manufacture. Bronze Age arrows weren't just pointed sticks, but engineered projectiles with carefully designed heads, shafts, and fletching optimized for different targets and ranges. Some arrows included special heads designed to penetrate armor, while others were optimized for maximum wounding potential against unarmored targets. Metallurgy reached extraordinary heights during the Bronze Age. Bronze smiths understood complex alloy ratios and could produce different types of bronze for specific applications. Weapons bronze was different from armor bronze, which was different from tool bronze. Some applications used lead additions for weight, while others incorporated tin ratios that created specific hardness characteristics. Manufacturing techniques allowed for mass production of standardized equipment while maintaining quality control. Archaeological evidence shows that Bronze Age armies used standardized weapon patterns that allowed for interchangeable parts and simplified maintenance. This level of industrial organization was essential for equipping large armies, like those involved in the Trojan War. Quality control in weapon manufacturing reached sophisticated levels. Bronze Age smiths used testing procedures to ensure weapons met performance standards before being issued to warriors. Defective weapons could be remelted and recast, while superior weapons were often marked with maker's symbols that served as quality guarantees. Specialized tools for weapon maintenance were nearly as sophisticated as the weapons themselves. Bronze Age armies carried complete toolkits for sharpening, repairing, and modifying weapons in the field. This maintenance capability was essential for extended campaigns, where weapons saw heavy use and couldn't be easily replaced. The economics of weapon production influenced Bronze Age society in profound ways. The copper and tin required for bronze had to be imported over long distances, creating trade networks that connected distant regions. The skilled labor required for weapon production supported specialized craftsmen who formed important social and economic classes. Innovation continued throughout the Bronze Age as competing societies sought military advantages through superior technology. The Trojan War period saw rapid development of new weapon types and improvement of existing designs. This technological competition drove advances that influenced not just military equipment, but all aspects of Bronze Age material culture. The legacy of Bronze Age military technology extended far beyond the end of the Bronze Age itself. Many design principles and manufacturing techniques developed for Bronze Age weapons influenced later iron and steel weapon production. The organizational systems created to equip Bronze Age armies provided models for military logistics that remained influential for centuries. The warriors who fought at Troy weren't just soldiers following orders. They were heroes driven by a complex code of honor that governed every aspect of their behavior. Understanding the psychological framework that motivated Bronze Age warriors reveals why personal combat was so central to ancient warfare and how individual psychology shaped the course of the war. Honor, time, was the central organizing principle of Bronze Age warrior culture. A warrior's honor wasn't just personal reputation, but a tangible asset that determined social status, political influence, and even economic prosperity. Honor could be gained through brave deeds, generous behavior, and skillful combat. But it could also be lost through cowardice, stinginess, or failure to meet social obligations. The pursuit of glory, kleos, provided the ultimate motivation for heroic behavior. Bronze Age warriors believed that fame achieved through great deeds could provide a form of immortality. Their names and stories would be remembered long after their physical deaths. This belief motivated warriors to take extraordinary risks and perform spectacular feats that would be worthy of epic poetry. Combat between elite warriors followed ritualized patterns that reflected both practical needs and cultural values. Battles often began with challenges between champions, where individual warriors would fight single combat while their armies watched. These duels weren't just personal contests, but psychological warfare designed to demonstrate one side's superiority and demoralize the opposition. The famous concept of aristeia, the moment when a great warrior dominated the battlefield, reflected a real psychological phenomenon in Bronze Age warfare. When elite warriors were fighting at peak effectiveness, properly equipped and psychologically prepared, they could indeed achieve extraordinary feats that seemed almost supernatural to observers. Anger, menace, was considered a divine force that could possess warriors and drive them to superhuman achievements. The famous rage of Achilles, described in Homer's Iliad, wasn't just poetic metaphor, but a psychological state that Bronze Age warriors deliberately cultivated. Controlled rage could enhance combat effectiveness, while uncontrolled anger could lead to reckless behavior and defeat. The relationship between warriors and their weapons was deeply personal and often spiritual. Elite warriors named their weapons, performed rituals to consecrate them, and believed that superior weapons contained something approaching a soul. Losing one's weapons was considered a form of spiritual as well as military defeat. Loyalty relationships between warriors were central to Bronze Age military organization. The bonds between leaders and followers weren't just military contracts, but personal relationships that carried emotional and spiritual dimensions. Breaking these loyalty bonds was considered one of the worst possible betrayals, worse even than cowardice in battle. The role of divine favor in warrior psychology was complex and sophisticated. Warriors believed that the gods could influence combat outcomes, but they also understood that divine favor had to be earned through proper behavior, appropriate sacrifices, and demonstrated courage. Religion wasn't separate from military activity, but integrated into every aspect of warrior culture. Shame, eidos, served as a powerful motivating force that could drive warriors to extraordinary efforts to avoid disgrace. The fear of being called a coward or of failing to meet cultural expectations could motivate warriors to fight against overwhelming odds rather than accept the social death that came with loss of honor. The treatment of enemies reflected complex psychological and cultural attitudes toward warfare. Worthy enemies deserved respect and proper treatment, while unworthy enemies could be treated with contempt. The ability to recognize and respond appropriately to different types of enemies was considered a mark of warrior wisdom. Post-combat behavior was as ritualized and psychologically important as the fighting itself. Proper treatment of the dead, appropriate distribution of plunder, and correct celebration of victory were all essential elements of warrior culture. failure to observe these customs could undermine the psychological benefits of military success. The integration of violence and social life in Bronze Age culture created psychological frameworks that could seem alien to modern perspectives. Violence wasn't seen as antisocial, but as a normal and necessary part of community life. Warriors were expected to be both fierce in battle and gentle in peacetime social interactions. Women played crucial roles in warrior psychology, both as inspirations for heroic behavior and as judges of warrior achievement. The approval of women, wives, mothers, sisters, and lovers, provided important motivation for warriors and validation for their achievements. The threat of losing feminine approval could be as powerful a motivator as the promise of gaining masculine respect. The psychological preparation for combat involved both individual and group rituals. Warriors performed personal ceremonies to prepare mentally for battle, while participating in group activities that built unit cohesion and shared resolve. These preparations weren't just practical, but spiritual, designed to align the warrior's consciousness with divine will and cosmic order. Fear was acknowledged as a natural part of warfare, but Bronze Age warrior culture provided psychological tools for managing and overcoming fear. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act appropriately despite fear. Warriors who could function effectively while afraid were more respected than those who claimed to feel no fear at all. The long duration of the Trojan War created unique psychological challenges that tested warrior culture in unprecedented ways. Maintaining motivation and morale during an extended siege required psychological resources that went beyond those needed for short campaigns. Both sides had to develop new ways of sustaining warrior psychology over extended periods. The Greek expedition to Troy was fundamentally a naval operation, representing one of the largest and most sophisticated maritime military campaigns in ancient history. Understanding Bronze Age naval warfare reveals how ancient civilizations projected power across water and conducted complex amphibious operations. Bronze Age warships were sophisticated vessels designed specifically for military operations. Unlike merchant ships optimized for cargo capacity, warships prioritized speed, maneuverability, and fighting capability. The typical warship was long and narrow, powered by both sails and oars, with specialized features that made them effective fighting platforms. The most distinctive feature of Bronze Age warships was the bronze-reinforced ram mounted at the bow. These rams weren't just pointed projections, but carefully engineered weapons designed to punch holes below the waterline of enemy ships. The ram attack required precise timing and positioning, making naval combat a test of seamanship as much as courage. Ship construction techniques reached remarkable sophistication during the Bronze Age. Warships used edge-joined planking with internal frames that provided both strength and flexibility. The hulls were often reinforced with bronze fittings and specialized joints that could withstand the stresses of ramming attacks and rough seas. Crews for Bronze Age warships were typically 50 to 100 men, including both fighting personnel and sailors. The division of labor was crucial for effective operations. Some crew members specialized in sailing and ship handling, while others focused on combat. The most elite warriors served as marines who would board enemy vessels or lead amphibious assaults. Naval tactics evolved to take advantage of wind and current patterns, while maximizing the effectiveness of ram attacks. Successful naval commanders understood how to position their fleets to gain tactical advantages, and how to coordinate attacks involving multiple ships. The most effective tactic was the diek plus, a line-ahead attack that allowed ships to ram enemies while minimizing exposure to counterattacks. The logistics of naval operations were enormously complex. Ships had to carry not only fighting crews, but also supplies for extended operations. Water storage was particularly challenging, since ships had limited capacity, but crews required substantial daily water rations. food preservation techniques had to account for salt air and limited storage space. Navigation techniques allowed Bronze Age ships to operate far from familiar coasts. Navigators used celestial observations, coastal landmarks, and knowledge of wind and current patterns to find their way across open water. The most skilled navigators could conduct night sailing and navigate in poor weather conditions. Beach warfare was a specialized aspect of naval operations that required coordination between ships and shore-based forces. Amphibious assaults had to account for tides, beach conditions, and defensive preparations. Success required precise timing and coordination between naval and land forces. Ship-to-ship combat involved both ramming attacks and boarding actions. Ramming required high speed and precise positioning, but offered the possibility of sinking enemy vessels with a single attack. Boarding actions were more like land combat, but conducted on unstable platforms with limited maneuvering room. Defensive naval tactics included formation sailing, mutual support between ships, and coordination with shore-based defenses. Ships could protect each other against ramming attacks by maintaining proper spacing and positioning. Shore-based forces could provide archery support and secure beaching areas for friendly vessels. Naval intelligence was crucial for successful operations. Commanders needed information about enemy ship positions, weather conditions, and coastal defenses. Fast scout vessels could gather intelligence while communication systems using signals and messengers coordinated fleet movements. The economic impact of naval warfare was enormous. Building and maintaining fleets required substantial resources, including specialized materials, skilled craftsmen, and large crews. The cost of naval operations often exceeded that of land campaigns because of the complexity and expense of ships and equipment. Seasonal factors significantly affected naval operations. Winter storms made sailing dangerous or impossible, while summer calms could strand fleets without wind for propulsion. Successful naval commanders learned to work with seasonal patterns rather than against them. Harbour and port facilities were essential for supporting naval operations. Fleets needed secure bases for maintenance, resupply, and protection during storms. The control of strategic harbours could determine the outcome of naval campaigns by limiting enemy operations while supporting friendly forces. The psychological aspects of naval warfare created unique challenges for both crews and commanders. Fighting on water required different skills and mindset than land combat. The possibility of drowning added an extra dimension of fear that had to be managed through training and leadership. Naval communications presented special challenges because ships could be separated by distance and weather. Successful fleet operations required communication systems that could function despite these limitations. Flag signals, fire beacons, and courier ships all played roles in naval command and control. The legacy of Bronze Age naval warfare influenced maritime military thinking for centuries. The tactics, technologies, and organizational principles developed during this period provided foundations for later naval developments. The Greek expedition to Troy demonstrated that sophisticated naval operations were possible even with Bronze Age technology and resources. The fall of Troy through the famous wooden horse represents one of history's most audacious military deceptions. But understanding how it actually worked requires looking beyond mythology to examine the practical realities of Bronze Age siege warfare and psychological operations. The wooden horse wasn't a spontaneous inspiration, but the culmination of years of failed siege attempts that taught the Greeks important lessons about Troy's defensive capabilities and psychological vulnerabilities. By the 10th year of the siege, both sides understood each other's strengths and weaknesses with intimate detail. The horse strategy represented a sophisticated analysis of how to exploit Trojan characteristics that had previously been strengths. Construction of the horse required considerable engineering expertise and resources. Bronze Age craftsmen had to create a structure large enough to conceal a significant force while appearing to be a religious offering. The horse had to be sturdy enough to survive transport while incorporating hidden compartments and access points that wouldn't be obvious to observers. The size and appearance of the horse were carefully calculated for psychological effect. It had to be impressive enough to seem worthy of divine attention, while not being so large as to be obviously impractical. Archaeological evidence suggests the horse was probably 30 to 40 feet long and proportionally tall. Large enough to be visually impressive, but small enough to be moved by available technology. The selection of warriors to hide inside the horse required careful consideration of multiple factors. The men had to be among the most elite and experienced fighters, capable of operating effectively after hours of confinement in cramped conditions. They also had to be psychologically stable enough to remain hidden despite the stress of uncertainty and potential discovery. The deception involved more than just the horse itself. The Greeks had to stage a convincing withdrawal that would make the Trojans believe the siege was ended. This required coordinating the departure of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of warriors, while leaving behind carefully selected individuals to complete the deception. Sinon, the Greek warrior who stayed behind to convince the Trojans to accept the horse, played one of the most crucial roles in the entire operation. His performance had to be convincing enough to fool experienced Trojan leaders who were naturally suspicious of any Greek offering. The story he told, that the horse was an offering to Athena that would bring divine protection to whoever possessed it, exploited Trojan religious beliefs in sophisticated ways. The Trojans' decision to bring the horse inside their city wasn't simply naive trust, but reflected complex political and religious considerations. Different factions within Troy had different opinions about the horse, creating internal debates that the Greek deception was designed to exploit. The faction that favored accepting the horse eventually prevailed partly because of genuine religious conviction, and partly because of war weariness after 10 years of siege. The timing of the horse strategy was crucial to its success. The operation was launched during a religious festival, when Trojan vigilance might be reduced, and when the significance of a religious offering would be most compelling. The Greeks also waited for weather conditions that would allow their fleet to return quickly once the deception was discovered. The night assault from inside the horse required precise coordination and timing. The hidden warriors had to remain undetected until the moment was right, then emerge and secure key objectives before Trojan defenders could organize effective resistance. The most important objectives were the city gates, which had to be opened to allow the returning Greek army to enter. The psychological impact of the horse strategy went beyond its immediate military effects. The deception struck at the heart of Trojan confidence and demonstrated that even their strongest defenses could be circumvented through clever strategy. This psychological blow may have been as important as the physical assault in determining the final outcome. Archaeological evidence provides some support for the horse story, though not in the form that might be expected. Excavations at Troy have revealed evidence of fire and destruction that matches historical accounts of the city's fall. More intriguingly, archaeologists have found what may be fragments of large wooden structures that could represent remains of siege equipment, including possibly the horse itself. Alternative interpretations of the horse story suggest it might represent a metaphor for other military techniques. Some historians propose that the horse was actually a siege tower or battering ram shaped like a horse. Others suggest it might have been a ship with a horse-shaped prow that was used for a surprise naval assault. While these interpretations are possible, they may underestimate the sophistication of Bronze Age psychological warfare. The success of the wooden horse strategy influenced military thinking for centuries after the Trojan War. The principle of using an enemy's strengths against them became a standard element of strategic thinking. The combination of deception, psychological manipulation, and precise timing demonstrated in the horse operation became a model for later military innovations. Modern analysis of the wooden horse, using principles of military intelligence and psychological operations, suggests that the strategy was far more sophisticated than simple trickery. It required detailed intelligence about Trojan culture, politics, and psychology. The Greeks had to understand not just what the Trojans would do, but why they would do it. This level of psychological insight represents one of the most advanced examples of strategic thinking in the ancient world. The fall of Troy wasn't just the end of a single city, but a pivotal moment in the collapse of Bronze Age civilization throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Understanding the broader context reveals why this conflict became a turning point that shaped the ancient world for centuries to come. Troy's destruction came at a time when Bronze Age civilization was already under severe stress from multiple sources. Climate change was reducing agricultural productivity throughout the region. Economic disruption was affecting trade networks that connected distant cultures. Political instability was weakening established kingdoms and empires. The Trojan War both reflected these broader problems and accelerated their development. The economic impact of the 10-year siege extended far beyond the immediate participants. Resources that would normally have been devoted to trade, construction, and cultural development were consumed by military operations. The disruption of trade routes through the Dardanelles affected commerce throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Agricultural regions were stripped of manpower as farmers became soldiers. The collapse of Troy eliminated one of the most important commercial and cultural centers in the Bronze Age world. Troy's position at the intersection of European and Asian trade routes had made it a crucial link in economic networks that connected civilizations from Britain to India. Without this central hub, alternative trade routes had to be developed, often at greater cost and risk. The refugee crisis following Troy's fall destabilized regions throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Trojan survivors and their allies became part of the broader movement of displaced populations that archaeologists call the Sea Peoples. These refugees weren't just passive victims, but active forces that contributed to political and military upheavals across the region. The Greek victory at Troy proved to be a Pyrrhic triumph that contributed to the collapse of Mycenaean civilization within a century of the war's end. The resources expended on the siege, combined with the disruption of normal economic activities, weakened Greek kingdoms beyond their ability to recover. The returning heroes found their homelands impoverished and politically unstable. Archaeological evidence shows widespread destruction and abandonment of Bronze Age sites throughout the Eastern Mediterranean during the centuries following the Trojan War. Cities were burned, palaces were abandoned, and populations declined dramatically. While not all of this destruction can be attributed directly to the war, the conflict certainly contributed to the instability that made such widespread collapse possible. The technology and expertise that had created Bronze Age civilization were lost or dispersed during this period of collapse. The specialized knowledge required for bronze working, monumental architecture, and complex administration disappeared in many regions. It would take centuries for new civilizations to redevelop comparable capabilities. The political systems that had governed Bronze Age civilization were replaced by simpler, more localized forms of organization. The great kingdoms and empires that had dominated the region were replaced by smaller city-states and tribal groups. The complex diplomatic networks that had connected distant civilizations fragmented into more limited regional relationships. Cultural and artistic traditions that had flourished during the Bronze Age were disrupted or lost entirely. The palace cultures that had supported artists, musicians, and writers disappeared. Literacy declined dramatically in many regions as the administrative systems that had required written records collapsed. The religious and ideological systems that had legitimized Bronze Age political authority were challenged by the evident failure of established institutions to provide security and prosperity. New religious movements emerged that offered different explanations for human suffering. and different hopes for the future. However, the collapse of Bronze Age civilization also created opportunities for innovation and cultural development. The breakdown of established hierarchies allowed new forms of social organization to emerge. The displacement of populations created cultural mixing that led to new artistic and intellectual traditions. The need to rebuild societies with limited resources encouraged technological and organizational innovations. The memory of the Trojan War became a foundational element in the cultural identity of later civilizations. The stories of heroic warriors, divine intervention, and ultimate tragedy provided models for understanding human nature and destiny that influenced literature, philosophy, and political thinking for millennia. The historical lessons of Troy's fall influenced strategic thinking throughout the ancient world. The demonstration that even the strongest defenses could be overcome through clever strategy and persistent effort became a standard element of military education. The importance of maintaining alliances and managing resources during extended conflicts became accepted principles of statecraft. The Trojan War also established patterns of conflict between East and West that would recur throughout ancient history. The confrontation between Greek and Trojan civilizations became a prototype for later conflicts between European and Asian powers. The cultural stereotypes and political attitudes established during this period influenced international relations for centuries. The archaeological record suggests that some regions were able to adapt successfully to the challenges that destroyed other Bronze Age civilizations. These success stories provide insights into the factors that determine survival versus collapse during periods of widespread crisis. They also demonstrate that historical change, even during catastrophic periods, isn't uniform or inevitable. For centuries, Troy existed only in poetry and myth until Heinrich Schliemann's archaeological work in the 19th century began the process of separating historical fact from literary fiction. The ongoing excavation of Troy represents one of archaeology's greatest success stories and reveals how modern science can illuminate ancient history. Heinrich Schliemann's discovery of Troy in the 1870s was both a triumph and a tragedy. His enthusiastic excavation methods succeeded in locating the ancient city, but also destroyed much archaeological evidence that could have provided crucial information about how the city developed and functioned. Schliemann's work established that Troy was a real place, but it also demonstrated the importance of careful scientific methodology in archaeological investigation. The location of Troy at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey was already suspected by earlier scholars, but Schliemann was the first to conduct systematic excavations that could prove the identification. The site's position overlooking the Dardanelles matched geographical descriptions in ancient sources, while the archaeological remains showed evidence of a major Bronze Age city with impressive fortifications. Schliemann's most famous discovery was what he called Priam's treasure, a collection of gold and silver artifacts that he believed belonged to the legendary king of Troy. While these objects have since been dated to earlier periods than the Trojan War, they demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of the civilizations that flourished at the site. Later archaeological work by Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Carl Blegen refined understanding of Troy's development and identified the specific level that corresponded to the city destroyed during the legendary war. This work revealed that Troy was actually a series of cities built one on top of another over thousands of years, with each new city rising from the ruins of its predecessor. The Troy that most likely corresponds to Homer's Ilion is Troy 7a, which shows evidence of siege warfare and violent destruction dating to around 1200 BCE. This level contained evidence of desperate defensive measures, including the construction of new walls and the storage of large pottery jars that might have been used for collecting water during a siege. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized understanding of Troy's size, organization, and importance. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and other non-invasive survey methods have revealed that the city was much larger than previously realized, with a lower town extending well beyond the citadel that earlier archaeologists had identified as the complete city. The discovery of the lower town transformed understanding of Troy's significance in the Bronze Age world. Rather than a modest fortress, Troy was revealed to be a major urban center comparable to other important Bronze Age cities. The lower town contained residential areas, workshops, and commercial districts that housed a substantial population. Recent excavations have also revealed evidence of Troy's international connections through pottery, metalwork, and other artifacts that show connections with cultures throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond. These findings confirm that Troy was indeed a major center of Bronze Age trade and diplomacy. Archaeological evidence has also provided insights into the siege warfare capabilities of Bronze Age armies. Excavations have revealed remains of defensive works, siege equipment, and destruction layers that correspond to historical accounts of prolonged siege operations. This evidence helps validate the basic historical framework of the Trojan War, while providing details about how ancient siege warfare actually functioned. The preservation of organic materials at Troy has been exceptional, allowing archaeologists to recover evidence of daily life during the Bronze Age. Preserved plant remains, animal bones, and other organic materials provide information about diet, agriculture, and economic activities that illuminate how ancient urban civilizations functioned. Studies of human remains from Troy have provided insights into the health, nutrition, and demographics of Bronze Age populations. Evidence of injuries and medical treatments reveals information about ancient medical practices and the effects of warfare on urban populations. The ongoing excavation of Troy continues to yield new discoveries that refine understanding of Bronze Age civilization and the historical basis of the Trojan War. Recent finds include evidence of ritual activities, craft production, and architectural innovations that demonstrate the sophistication of Trojan society. International cooperation in Troy's excavation has become a model for archaeological projects worldwide. The current excavation involves specialists from multiple countries working together to apply the most advanced archaeological techniques to understanding this crucial site. The conservation and presentation of Troy as a UNESCO World Heritage Site has created new challenges and opportunities for archaeological research. Balancing the needs of scientific investigation with heritage preservation and public access requires careful planning and international cooperation. Digital archaeology and computer modeling have created new possibilities for understanding Troy's development and significance. Three-dimensional reconstructions allow researchers to visualize how the city might have appeared during different periods, while database management systems help organize and analyze the enormous quantities of data generated by modern excavations. The integration of archaeological evidence with historical and literary sources continues to refine understanding of the relationship between Homer's epic poetry and historical reality. While significant questions remain about specific details, the archaeological evidence strongly supports the conclusion that the Trojan War was based on real historical events. The story of Troy became more than just an ancient war. It became the foundation myth that shaped Western concepts of heroism, honor, and the human condition. Understanding how the Trojan War influenced later cultures reveals its continuing importance in modern civilization. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, based on the traditions of the Trojan War, became the foundational texts of Western literature. These epics didn't just tell entertaining stories, but established literary techniques, psychological insights, and moral frameworks that influenced writing for over 2 millennia. The concept of epic poetry itself, with its combination of heroic action and human emotion, became a model for literary achievement. The characters from the Trojan War became archetypal figures that represented different aspects of human nature, Achilles embodied the warrior's dilemma between personal honor and social responsibility. Hector represented the ideal of defending one's community despite personal cost. Odysseus became the model of intelligence and adaptability, triumphing over adversity. These character types continue to appear in literature, film, and other forms of storytelling. Greek education and culture were built around the Trojan War stories. Young Greeks memorized passages from Homer as part of their basic education, learning not just literary skills, but moral values and cultural identity. The warriors of Troy became role models for courage, loyalty, and noble behavior that shaped Greek concepts of citizenship and virtue. Roman civilization adopted and adapted Trojan War traditions for their own cultural purposes. Virgil's Aeneid reimagined the aftermath of Troy's fall to create a founding myth for Rome itself. By claiming descent from Trojan refugees, Romans connected their empire to the heroic traditions of the Bronze Age while establishing their own cultural identity. The influence of Trojan War traditions extended throughout European literature and culture. Medieval writers used Trojan themes to explore concepts of chivalry, courtly love, and noble behavior. Renaissance artists found in Troy stories that combined classical learning with dramatic human emotions. Modern writers continue to draw on Trojan War themes to examine contemporary issues. The psychological insights embedded in Trojan War stories anticipated many discoveries of modern psychology. The complex motivations of characters like Achilles, Agamemnon, and Helen provided sophisticated analyses of human behavior that remain relevant today. The exploration of themes like anger, pride, loyalty, and love established literary psychology as a legitimate way of understanding human nature. Military traditions throughout Western civilization have drawn inspiration from Trojan War examples. The concepts of honorable combat, loyalty to comrades, and sacrifice for larger causes became fundamental elements of military culture. Military academies still teach lessons about leadership, strategy, and moral behavior using examples from the Trojan War. Political thought has been influenced by the governmental and diplomatic concepts illustrated in Trojan War stories. The tension between individual heroism and collective responsibility, the challenges of maintaining alliances, and the consequences of poor leadership remain relevant to contemporary political analysis. Artistic traditions have repeatedly returned to Trojan War themes as sources of inspiration. From ancient Greek pottery to Renaissance paintings to modern films, artists have found in Troy stories that combine visual drama with emotional depth. The war's themes of love, betrayal, heroism, and tragedy provide rich material for artistic expression. Philosophical traditions have used Trojan War examples to explore fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the meaning of life. The war's combination of individual choice and cosmic fate provides a framework for examining how people should live in an uncertain world. Modern archaeological and historical study of Troy has created new ways of understanding the relationship between myth and reality. The discovery that Troy was a real place has validated the historical core of epic traditions while raising new questions about how oral traditions preserve and transform historical memory. The continuing popularity of Troy stories in contemporary media demonstrates their enduring relevance to modern audiences. Recent films, novels, and television programs based on Trojan War themes show that these ancient stories continue to resonate with contemporary concerns about war, leadership, and human relationships. Educational systems continue to use Troy stories as vehicles for teaching literary analysis, historical thinking, and moral reasoning. The complexity of Trojan War narratives provides excellent examples for examining how literature works and how historical traditions develop over time. The global influence of Western civilization has spread Trojan War traditions to cultures throughout the world. While these stories originated in a specific time and place, their themes of heroism, sacrifice, and human struggle have proven relevant to diverse cultural contexts. The archaeological preservation of Troy as a World Heritage Site ensures that future generations will be able to connect with the physical reality that inspired these influential stories. The combination of archaeological evidence and literary tradition provides a unique opportunity to understand how historical events become cultural memories that shape civilizations for millennia. Contemporary conflicts and challenges continue to find parallels in Trojan War stories. The war's lessons about the costs of pride, the importance of alliances, and the human consequences of political decisions remain relevant to understanding modern international relations and military conflicts. As our journey through the real story of Troy draws to a close, we must consider what this ancient conflict teaches us about human nature, warfare, and civilization. The lessons of Troy remain relevant because the fundamental challenges faced by Bronze Age warriors and leaders continue to shape our modern world. The Trojan War demonstrates that technology alone doesn't determine the outcome of conflicts. While the Greeks had advantages in numbers and resources, Troy's survival for 10 years shows that defensive preparation, strategic thinking, and psychological resilience can offset technological superiority. This lesson remains relevant in an age when military technologies continue to evolve rapidly. The importance of alliances and coalition warfare, illustrated in the Trojan conflict, continues to influence modern military and political strategy. Both sides succeeded or failed, largely based on their ability to maintain complex alliance systems over extended periods. The challenges of coordinating diverse forces with different capabilities and objectives remain central to contemporary international relations. The human costs of prolonged conflict, vividly illustrated in both Homer's poetry and archaeological evidence, provide sobering reminders about the consequences of warfare. The decade-long siege affected not just the immediate combatants, but entire civilizations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Modern conflicts similarly create effects that extend far beyond the immediate participants. The role of individual leadership in shaping historical events is powerfully demonstrated in Troy's stories. Characters like Agamemnon, Hector, and Achilles show how personal decisions by key leaders can determine the fate of entire civilizations. This lesson about the importance of leadership quality remains relevant in contemporary politics and military affairs. The relationship between myth and history illustrated by Troy's archaeological discovery shows how cultural memories preserve and transform historical events. Understanding this process helps us interpret other historical traditions and appreciate how societies create meaning from their past experiences. The economic and social disruption caused by the Trojan War contributed to the collapse of Bronze Age civilization throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. This demonstrates how military conflicts can trigger broader systemic changes that affect entire regions for centuries. Modern examples of similar cascade effects can be seen in contemporary conflicts and their aftermath. The psychological insights embedded in Trojan War traditions anticipate many modern understandings of trauma, leadership, and human motivation. The complex character development in Homer's epics provides sophisticated analyses of how people respond to extreme stress and moral dilemmas that remain relevant to contemporary psychology and leadership studies. The technological innovations driven by Bronze Age warfare influence developments far beyond the military sphere. The organizational systems, metallurgical techniques, and engineering solutions developed for warfare found applications in civilian activities that shaped ancient civilizations. Modern military research continues to drive innovations that benefit civilian society. The cultural legacy of Troy shows how shared stories and traditions can provide social cohesion and moral guidance across generations. The values embedded in Trojan War narratives, courage, loyalty, honor, and sacrifice continue to influence how societies define heroism and citizenship. The archaeological study of Troy demonstrates the value of scientific approaches to understanding the past. The combination of careful excavation, scientific analysis, and international cooperation has revealed information about Bronze Age civilization that would have been impossible to obtain through literary sources alone. The environmental factors that contributed to Bronze Age collapse, including climate change and resource depletion, provide warnings about contemporary challenges. The vulnerability of complex civilizations to environmental stress remains a crucial concern for modern societies facing similar challenges. The diplomatic sophistication demonstrated by Bronze Age alliances shows that ancient civilizations were capable of complex international relations that rival modern diplomatic systems. Understanding these ancient precedents provides perspective on contemporary diplomatic challenges and opportunities. The persistence of Troy stories across thousands of years demonstrates the power of narrative to preserve and transmit cultural values. The techniques used by ancient storytellers to make historical events emotionally resonant continue to influence how modern societies communicate important ideas. The integration of warfare with religious and cultural practices shown in Troy traditions illustrates how military conflicts often involve competing worldviews and value systems. Understanding this dimension of conflict remains important for analyzing contemporary conflicts that involve cultural and religious differences. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider that you are connected to an unbroken chain of human experience that stretches back to the Bronze Age warriors who fought on the plains of Troy. Their struggles with leadership, loyalty, courage, and loss are your struggles. Their questions about honor, duty, and the meaning of life are your questions. The fire burns low beside you, the night is peaceful around you, but somewhere in the darkness, the lessons of Troy continue to echo through time. The warriors who fought there discovered truths about human nature that remain valid today. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. That honor is earned through action rather than birth, and that the greatest victories often come at the highest costs. The real Troy was both more and less than Homer's epic suggests. It was more in terms of its archaeological reality, a sophisticated Bronze Age city with impressive technology and international connections. It was less in terms of supernatural intervention. Real warriors fought with bronze and courage rather than divine assistance. But the human drama that unfolded there was every bit as compelling as the poetry suggests. Real warriors did face impossible choices between personal desires and social obligations. Real leaders did struggle with the burdens of command, while their decisions affected thousands of lives. Real people did sacrifice everything for principles they believed worth dying for. Sweet dreams, modern heir to ancient wisdom. The warriors of Troy sleep beneath the Turkish soil, but their spirits live on in everyone who faces difficult choices with courage, who stands by friends in times of danger, and who believes that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Tomorrow brings new challenges that may require the same courage that Hector showed defending his city, the same intelligence that Odysseus used to solve impossible problems, and the same loyalty that bound Bronze Age warriors to their comrades. The weapons and technology have changed, but the fundamental human challenges remain the same. Rest well, knowing that you carry within you the same capacity for heroism that inspired the warriors of Troy. Their story is your story, their struggles are your struggles, and their ultimate triumph, the achievement of immortal fame through noble action, remains available to everyone willing to pay the price in courage and commitment. The walls of Troy have fallen, but the principles they defended endure. Honor, loyalty, courage, and sacrifice remain the foundations of human civilization, as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago on the windy plains of ancient Troy.